Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. We're going to explore how to have a genuine green impact, whether that stops at making small changes or must involve active political engagement. In 2024, the global market for eco-labeled products crossed the $500 billion mark. Sales of reusable water bottles hit $10 billion. Plant-based meat alternatives, electric vehicles, bamboo toothbrushes, compostable phone cases. The shelves are groaning with ways for conscientious consumers to buy their way to a better planet. And yet, global carbon emissions still hit another record high that same year. The concentration of atmospheric CO2 passed 427 parts per million, and it currently stands at 429 parts per billion as I speak. And microplastics are turning up in human brain tissue. So the gap between what we're buying and what's actually changing has never been wider. And that gap is exactly where our guest today has spent his career. Michael Maniates is an environmental social scientist, a senior fellow with the Story of Stuff, and the author of The Living Green Myth, The Promise and Limits of Lifestyle Environmentalism, published by Polity Press in November 2025. He's also the co-author of Consumption Corridors, Living a Good Life Within Sustainable Limits. And before that, he spent more than 30 years teaching environmental studies at Allegheny College, Oberlin College, and the Yale NUS College in Singapore, where he was the inaugural head of the Environmental Studies program. And right now he's writing a new book called Stop Wasting Time, 4 Paths to Deep Sustainability in Higher Education. Michael's central argument is provocative and it's well evidenced. The story that we've been told about saving the planet through better consumer choices, what sociologist Elizabeth Shove has labeled the ABC model for attitudes, behavior, and choices, is empirically fragile and strategically dangerous. Decades of research document what scholars call the attitude behavior gap and the behavior impact gap. Pro-environmental attitudes don't reliably produce pro-environmental behavior, and when they do, the aggregate impact on emissions is, in most cases, negligible. Michael calls the resulting cycle of earnest effort, negligible impact, and our resulting creeping anxiety that we can't turn the corner to become sustainable, the trinity of despair, and he proposes a framework of minimum and maximum consumption standards, a floor below which no one should fall, and a ceiling above which individual consumption begins to destroy others' chances at a good life. And those should be arrived at through democratic deliberation, not expert decree. Now, at Earth 911, we publish a lot of green living advice every day. How to recycle right, reduce food waste, choose better products, compost, fix what you have, make it last longer. We also consistently urge our audience to engage their elected representatives at every level because we've long recognized that individual action without systemic change only salves individual concerns without actually moving the societal needle on climate. Michael's research is a sharper version of that perspective, and I invited him to talk with you all because we want every person who reads Earth 911 to have the greatest possible impact. If the social science says there's more effective places to invest our environmental energy alongside our daily choices, we want to understand where those places are and how we can get there. Open minds try more ideas, and trying more ideas is how we will eventually get to less waste overall. You can find Michael and his work at michaelmaniates.com. That's all one word, no space, no dash, michaelmaniates.com. Check it out. So, is the living green story we've been telling ourselves helping or standing between us and the systemic changes we actually need? Let's find out right after this quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, Michael. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mitch. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. Your work is fascinating, and I can appreciate the challenge of trying to speak to people who want to do the right thing, but are not necessarily taking all the steps that they need to in order to enact the change in the world. And so I want to start off with a kind of a basic question. You don't argue that making small changes in lifestyle or embracing green products isn't making a difference, but that it isn't enough. So what is your advice to have a genuine positive impact for the environment?
Yeah, I think buying green and living lean, which is something that so many of us do, can make a difference in our lives for a whole host of reasons. It can help us be sort of more aware of our surroundings. It can help us walk our talk. It often helps us protect our families or friends from toxins, especially if we're big users of organic foods. But what it can't do, despite what we often hear as consumers or what we may sometimes say as marketers, what Living Green can't do is drive that fundamental social transformation for sustainability. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that that I describe in my book and that others call out as well. The impact of these green gestures is too small. Uh, they don't deliver meaningful, consistent benefits. What benefits do arise are quickly swamped by expanding economic growth. And oftentimes the changes we really need to be making just aren't for sale. And so our ability as a consumer to drive those changes is difficult at best. It seems to me that our best chance for making a difference is to start thinking, or maybe just thinking harder, about how to be a citizen in community with others,
Mhm.
not as a solitary consumer in the checkout line. And that means working with others where we can to try to shift everyday patterns of life in genuinely sustainable directions so that acting sustainably is, as entrepreneur Paul Hawken once said, so that acting sustainably becomes natural and normal. It's easy as falling off a log rather than the product of intentionally virtuous acts that are often difficult to sustain. And so this is really a call for community connection, for becoming a citizen expert in a particular issue, from drawing from one's own expertise and to work with others to try to create new ways of living.
That suggests that the first step is really to see yourself as part of a system. And you use really vivid metaphors like it's the maze, not the mouse. And so, thinking about it from that perspective, the complexity of the world we live in, how do you suggest someone try to, well, let's say somebody who currently invests in environmental energy toward purchases should transform that into some broader, meaningful reaction? Is it a matter of looking up in the checkout line and starting to talk to other people? Where do you begin?
Well, it could be, and I do not want to in any way denigrate people's efforts as consumers to try to make things
Hmm.
happen. I came up as an energy guy and helped run a community energy project for many years in a small Rust Belt town in Pennsylvania that was sort of talking efficiency. But at the end of the day, if we take energy, for example, lots of these sort of issues are beyond our own ability to hit them as consumers. And so what it really depends on, at least as I argue in this little book that I've written, is that one needs to identify where one's passion is. So let's say your passion is energy. You know, you've outfitted your house. You're using all the best appliances. Maybe you've got some solar panels on the roof. You're doing what you can as an individual consumer, but to really kind of make a difference to get at that playing field that's tilted fundamentally towards fossil fuels and an expansionist carbon emitting economy, to really get at that, it does mean trying to find like-minded people. And that can be in your own community, that can be in your nation state. It can be networked globally. There are lots of people coming together doing very interesting things, and it's to find those people, and it's then to begin to experiment, often in your own community initially, but perhaps beyond that, to experiment with others, to try to shift subsidies, taxes, the default settings in everyday society, to begin to try to shift the maze, if you will,
Hmm.
rather than, as so many of us do, and I have done in my past life as an environmentalist, as so many of us might do, is to blame individuals for
Yeah.
being insufficiently educated, right, or having bad values. I've got a chapter in my book that it's titled "Why Environmentalists Don't Get Invited to Parties." It's because nobody wants to have their finger wagged at them. It's to begin to think about how to rejigger everyday life so that we unconsciously act sustainably, even when we don't realize it, because that's just how things are set up.
I'm put in mind of the Matrix that Neo starts to see the Matrix and then can begin to interact and really change it. But and Your background's interesting. You ran a yogurt shop in Berkeley before becoming an academic, and you, like you said, you're an energy guy, and you worked for, at least consulted for Pacific Gas and Electric at one point. How has that non-academic career arc shaped the way you think about systemic change versus that individual virtue we were talking about a moment ago?
Yeah, I came up as an I came up I became I came up as an adult in the environmental movement in the mid to late 70s as a undergraduate student at Berkeley. My first job actually before going to Pacific Gas and Electric was working for Amory Lovins in San
Wow. Okay.
Francisco. Yeah, for the International Project for Soft Energy Paths. It's just, a kid, fresh-faced kid right out of college. Um, this tension between systemic change and individual virtue, as I recall, in the late 70s and early 80s, they were actually one and the same. That individual virtue around the environment was involved, kind of brainstorming with others, maybe over coffee or a beer, with how you work with others to shift change. There were no green products really to purchase back then.
Mhm.
Sort of enacting your own environmental concerns through as a consumer really just wasn't on the table, and so this separation now of individual virtue in the checkout line versus thinking about systemic change, begins to come in the late 80s, and I think it's fully entrenched now to the point where it seems to me that what we're really looking at here is not so much a crisis of democracy, that sounds overwrought, but a lack of familiarity that many of us have with the arts of citizenship and democracy. I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s and early 80s, it was just natural to get drawn into these collective actions because that's what everybody was doing. Now, we all know it's we don't typically know our neighbor. We're on our devices. We tend to be more isolated. The whole ecosystem of groups that folks might have joined, from the PTA to bowling leagues to other kinds of ways of connecting with our friends and neighbors, have atrophied. And so, what I'm really calling for, as others are as well, is a reinvigoration of this community connection so that we can be present to others to come up with some pretty novel and experimental ideas for how to shift that maze, to marry individual virtue with systemic change, as opposed to having it be so separate these days around environmental issues.
It's interesting that the most prominent environmental story is often get off the grid, get on your own, take care of yourself, and shut down. And you pointed out in some conversations that we had before this interview that surveying shows that actively pursuing green behaviors often demobilizes people in terms of their civic engagement. That seems so counterintuitive, but
Yeah.
what you're saying suggests that we simply have oriented ourselves toward ourselves rather than toward the rest of the system we live in.
I think around environmental issues, again, this begins to become kind of full blown in the mid to late 80s, to the point where in 89, 90, that the number of consumer goods on the shelf that had a green kind of buy this and save the world doubled. And then
Mhm.
it doubled again in 92. So we see this real growth in these products.
And that led us into this isolated, take care of
It,
yourself perspective.
it does feel that way to me, to the point now where my students and folks older than them, the easiest way that they sort of imagine acting on the environment is by buying green products, and perhaps feeling in many ways guilty when they kind of slide off that path of perfection, because you just can't be perfect. But to go back to your question, in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, I was convinced that if you could just get people to screw in a light bulb today, they'd become energy activists tomorrow. I mean, I was like down with this notion because it seemed, because it seemed that people would say it, and myself, is that you had to start people off with the easy things, and what's easier than just buying something that's labeled sustainable in the marketplace. But what academics and marketers both have discovered is that if you come to environmental issues as a consumer first, that there is a strong tendency to believe that, well, you've sort of done your bit by buying green, and so there's no need to sort of engage in this, kind of messy business of meeting new people and trying to find a group that you could be simpatico with. It also separates you from the collective, the good feelings you get when you're working with others to make a difference. I mean, political scientists call this solitary solidarity benefits, and you don't really get that when you screw in a light bulb. I mean, in Erie, Pennsylvania, decades ago, I was part of a Sierra Club effort to try to get people mobilized. Where we were all going to go out and buy an energy efficient light bulb and screw it in together, and that was going to somehow invigorate us. And it just doesn't happen that way. And I would say finally, this is where my work with surveys and interviews has add something to the literature, is that in many cases, if you're trying to save the world in your own little way by doing these small acts of environmental stewardship, and you then that can lead you to this conclusion that social change happens when you get everybody on board. Because if we're going to save the world through the cumulative effect of these small consumption acts, because they're small, in order to have any appreciable impact, you've got to get a lot of people on board. And in my experience, this view of social change, that you need large majorities on board, believing your thing with you in order to drive change. Well, it's empirically untrue. That's not at all how social change happens. But worse, you never get that many people on board. And so if you believe that's your path to change, you will end up kind of nagging your friends to buy green. You'll become a pain in the behind. You'll guilt trip and shame, and then ultimately you'll feel kind of burnt out because you weren't able to get all these folks sort of going. So I don't think there's a grand conspiracy to defang the environmental movement, but if there were, it would be about propagating this theory of change that says you need supermajorities of people
Yeah.
on your side before the structural change can happen. In reality, you need 10, 15, 20% working strategically, and you're off to the races.
In fact, I've seen research that suggests that if you get to 3.5%, you're well on your way to that 15.
Exactly. And I share a variety of these reports and data with students who are smart, who are committed, who are passionate, both in the U.S. and then where I was for more than a decade in Singapore, and they are stunned. I mean, they never really got this in their education. And I can appreciate that because I've raised two daughters. They're grown, and I remarried, and I have an 8-year-old son who just as for school assignment yesterday was instructed to write an essay about how we need to reduce our use of single-use plastics in the household in order to get at the microplastics problem. Now, we should perhaps be reducing our own use of microplastics in the household, but if we really want to get at the microplastics problem, it probably requires some sort of set of agreements on production and on the creation of alternatives, which is sort of beyond the ability of households to sort of drive with their consumption choices. We drive that as citizens, not consumers. And so I think we get this at a very young age, that the way that you sort of solve these environmental problems is to get everybody on board doing the little things in the hope that this sums up in some tsunami of magical sort of political economic change. And I just have seen it again and again, just sort of pull people away from their creative abilities to strategically plan with others about how to make the world a better place.
The activism that you're describing to me is very interesting because I was involved in early privacy discussions and the founding of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Yeah.
And the EFF made a very conscious decision to focus on thought leadership and not build a constituency. And that seems to be the modern approach that many companies and activist organizations take, which is we'll build our own ivory tower and speak from it. How do you recommend an individual engage with companies, or conversely, companies engage with all the individuals they do business with in order to begin to influence policy to get the leverage that you're describing to, for instance, reduce the incidence of microplastics?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's a recipe. I teach a course on this, and the first thing that we talk about in the classroom is that there really are no hard and fast recipes in the policy sciences for how to take one's own energy, whether that's an individual or an organization, and how to translate that into policy change. There are a number of very interesting overlapping theories with whole sets of empirical cases about how that happens. But there is sort of no recipe. With that said, I think there are first principles that an organization or business would want to be thinking about. One is that we know that people become engaged as citizens. And I don't necessarily mean as sign carrying activists or as rabble rousers. There are so many different ways to be an active citizen. But people become engaged in citizenship when they identify with groups that are sort of pushing the ball downfield as opposed to the solitary consumption. They engage with citizenship as well when there's a moral claim or there's a sense of injustice. And they engage with citizenship when there is some sense that there's a goal out there that can be realized and they can be part of that. And when you get those three things together, it is like magic. Because what we know is that people are yearning to make a difference. I mean, it's a majority of folks in the U.S. and globally. They don't quite know how to do it, but if you can bring that together, then you can make some things happen. So with that in mind, individual businesses, entrepreneurs, tech firms, it seems to me, want to be thinking about what problem are they trying to solve with the product that they have or the service they're providing? What problem do they want to solve? In addition, I think they want to stay completely free and clear away from any kind of narrative that says engage with my product or service, and if you do it and you get all your friends to do it, the cumulative effect will be transformative change, because that kind of propagates that theory of social change that can be so debilitating, right? And then they need to think about, are there stakeholder groups out there that they can point people toward? Are there ways in which they can educate their consumers or their clients to think more strategically or broadly? Can they, in some sense, foster some new groups? I mean, there are lots of opportunities out there. Over my career, I've done some consulting with businesses. So you really have to kind of know what the landscape is. But I'll give you one example that I cite in the book, which is IKEA. We've got an IKEA just down the road. Everyone's got an IKEA just down the road. IKEA actually does a lot of survey work, and it publishes that. And in their most recent report, they identified that the two primary reasons that people buy green at IKEA is to save money and to drive change. And that's reflected in the billboards we see in IKEA around lighting, for example, or water efficiency. These are efficiency improvements that are going to save me money, and I can then be part of a process of social change. Now, I'm okay with the saving money part. It's the process of social change that I think gets pretty wonky. What I would say to IKEA is, what are you really trying to do here? What do you think the problem is? And if you think the problem is, for example, climate change, then don't sell your consumers this myth, this living green myth that they're part of change by doing these small things. Instead, you need to begin to think strategically about how you can provide information with each purchase, or how with email memberships you can direct them to organizations that are doing good work, or you can create a kind of community conversation at the local IKEA store on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, and we're going to feed everybody free breakfast who wants to come in and chat, about how we try to make a difference in our community. I mean,
Those little
there
Swedish hot dogs.
just, yeah, bring them, man. Or those meatballs would be awesome. But I think they need. I mean, I don't mean to beat up on IKEA, but they're
Yeah.
prominent. I think that if you really want your business plan, your commercial enterprise to drive a difference, as opposed to just fattening the bottom line, then you need to be thinking about those kinds of things. Now, there's no guarantee that it'll succeed. You assess it and then you move forward, but you've got to be committed to it.
As you say that, what you're describing in a way is movement marketing. And you're a critic of the ABC model of social change: shift attitudes, change behavior, and you get better choices. That seems to be the recurring theme, and you write about the fact that that's the case. Why does it keep coming back? What's the shift that we need to think about in that acronym?
And I'm glad you brought that up, because it really does get to the work that I've been doing, and others as well. So sociologists for some time have been scratching their head about why this ABC model sort of persists. And we see it all around us, right? It says we can educate people, they'll get better attitudes. If people have better attitudes, then they'll change their behavior. If they change their behavior, then they'll choose to purchase differently or live differently, in small ways, not large. And that will all sum up to create sort of transformative change. And it has been shown again and again, at least around environmental issues, just to be just woefully inadequate. Education doesn't lead always to change in attitudes. Change in attitudes, more often than not, doesn't lead to behavior change if you're in a particular environment that's sort of privileging a particular way of living.
Mhm.
Um, and then if you do change your behavior and make different choices, these are typically too small to make a difference. And the persistence of these kind of aberrant choices, aberrant as compared to what the system would want you to do, the persistence is so low. It's just it's mind-boggling. So why does this persist? Well, I think going back to my comment a moment ago, I think it's deeply ingrained in our educational system. I took a lot of courses as a high school kid, as an undergrad, that talked about we got to change people's values, which I think is crazy. I mean, Americans actually have as high or a higher set of environmental values than Europeans do in many cases. Pew tells us this, and other social science surveys shows. But if you're European, you wake up in the morning, public transit's right there. You're living in dense cities. There's all this structural stuff. It's the maze that's helping you move in the right direction. So it's deeply ingrained in our educational system. I think more importantly, though, this focus on people's attitudes and their values and their behaviors, I mean, turns a gnarly problem around power and politics and
Mhm.
influence into something that's kind of sanitized. We just need to get more information out there, and it shifts blame. It hides responsibility, and it turns consumers into scapegoats, and it makes politicians' lives easier as a result. Can't blame anyone from wanting to make their life easier, but the sum total of that is an approach to problem solving that just isn't cutting it.
Well, the maze is showing signs of stress, and you
Yeah.
were relating as we were starting this conversation that you're in Abu Dhabi today. Tell me what happened in the neighborhood. How do you see the old system, the maze, falling apart?
Well, there are always going to be cracks.
Mhm.
There are always going to be cracks. We live in complex systems, and these complex systems have emergent properties. Things happen, and opportunities arise. I mean, what we see now with the escalation of oil prices, of course, is a renewed interest, at least in the short term, in renewables, in EVs, and in other possibilities. And and a reminder that we are still dependent on the Middle East for oil, if not directly, indirectly, with the interplay of markets and price. So we we see a variety of opportunities, I think, emerging all the time. This is just the most vivid of the many that have come. And my argument all along is that if people are looking for these opportunities, these cracks in the maze, these opportunities to make change, if they're looking for them, they'll be surprised at how many they see in their community, in their state, in their nation, in the world. My concern is that if we're too busy sort of trying to figure out the best sustainable product to buy in the market and guilt tripping our neighbor to do the same, we're not looking for these larger sort of possibilities. But with that said, I think the systems that we live in are actually less stable and less permanent than they seem. But
Oh, certainly.
they put on a really good show, that we're stable. This is always how it's going to be, which I think invites all of us to be thinking about, like, what am I most interested in? Is it food? Is it energy? Is it transportation? And then how can I learn more about that? And then how can I begin working with others to figure out where the cracks sort of in the wall are, and then rolling up our sleeves with others and trying some new things.
Well, and I think experience it needs to be combined with the messaging we're talking about. And you're having the experience of missiles falling near your home.
Yeah, well, it's thankfully because the UAE, seems to have a great stock of interceptor missiles. It's not missiles; it's just shrapnel, but that's still pretty scary.
But that's just it. That you can feel the fraying of the system. You can feel
Yeah.
the tensions that we're under. How do you express that in a way that gets other people, that activates people who are far away? Like many Americans who are being told this war is almost like a video game.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't tried to invoke. I haven't yet tried to invoke what's going on here in my backyard to invoke that as a way of helping others sort of think about possibilities for change. Uh, it's just kind of happened. But what I have tried to do is to make the case, drawing from my own experience as well as the experience of others, to make the case that there's probably nothing more rewarding than working in common for the common good.
Hmm.
That joining in with others and just trying to make stuff happen. I mean, I understand, we've all been to meetings, maybe with our church or in our school, where they're just a disaster. People drone on, people monopolize. I mean, working with others isn't always a lovely experience, but more often than not, people will tell you that some of the best experiences they've had in their lives have been joining in with others to try to make things happen. And it's that joy of participation, that joy that comes with citizenship, that I've tried to talk up and sort of point to as a way of leading people or inspiring them to come together and to look for action as citizens as opposed to consumers. I've tended to go in that direction rather than pointing to the fraying of the system, which feels a little bit doom and gloom. But
Yeah,
your
sure.
point a moment ago is, I think, well taken. These systems are less permanent than we think. So it's not like we're pounding our head against the wall. We're being strategic actors looking for opportunities to kind of wheedle in there, make a difference.
Well, and I think what's next is always the biggest question for society, but we feel
Yeah.
very comfortable with the things that we were born into and are familiar with. This is a great place to take a quick commercial break before we continue this really important conversation, folks. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. Let's return to my conversation with Michael Maniates. He's the author of The Living Green Myth, The Promise and Limits of Lifestyle Environmentalism. Michael, before we continue, I want to ask a question about something you said in the last segment, and that is, it sounds like you're saying that saving money from energy or water efficiency innovations on offer at places like IKEA isn't necessarily a good thing. Can you break that down for us? Is it not a good idea to shop sustainably?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound dismissive of energy efficiency, water efficiency improvements of the sort that you might be able to purchase at a place like IKEA. It would be crazy, I think, to argue for a more inefficient system when it comes to energy or water use. The point that I was trying to make is simply that increased efficiency in resource use almost always produces over time greater consumption, not less consumption. Either that particular component, let's say energy, or increased consumption elsewhere in the economy that then swamps the good things that happened from your initial efficiency improvements. Economists have called this for some time the Jevons paradox, the idea that increased efficiency leads to increased consumption. And it has certainly come home to roost in a whole variety of green living resource efficiency improvements. So when thinking back to IKEA, my thought was simply that IKEA and other retailers like it, in terms of when they market resource efficiency, that's great. That maybe puts a little bit of a lid on consumption for a bit as these efficiency improvements take hold. But that buys us time to be thinking about more fundamental transformations in the economy that hardwire forms of reduced consumption and production, lower levels of material throughput in the economy that give us higher standard of living and better environmental outcomes. I think that's the charge for any business that's in the business of selling us green living as resource efficiency.
You proposed both a floor, a minimum consumption necessary to live a good life, and a ceiling, the maximum consumption that where one's choices don't destroy others' opportunity to make similar choices. And I'm sure the floor is easy to sell, but how do you make the case that there's an upper limit in societies that treats unlimited consumption as synonymous with freedom rather than threatening the ability of others to consume?
Yeah, no, that's the million-dollar question. So, Mitch, you're referring to this book, Consumption Corridors,
Mhm.
that I was part of with a number of long-standing European friends and colleagues published back in 2021. And for folks who are interested in following up this conversation, that book, Consumption Corridors, is available free to download,
Oh,
courtesy
I
of the
got it.
University of Munster. Yes, sir. So if folks want to follow up on this, they can pull it off of the web. This idea of a corridor, which is a minimum and a maximum, is very is moving forward, particularly in Europe. So it was, for me, it was a great education to be part of the project, because it helped me understand what was going on in European sort of politics. And it says that if we want to pursue the good life, it's not an environmental argument right off the bat. It says that if we want to be part of the good life, to know that we're living the best life we can, but it's not hurting other people. And the argument is that most people would be down with that, you know? No one rolls out of bed in the morning wanting to be complicit in environmental degradation or in making life awful for others. That if we want to be living the good life, then we need to be thinking about a minimum level of consumption for everybody so nobody kind of falls through the floor. And we probably need a maximum, because if we don't put a maximum, then there won't be sufficient sort of resources or flexibility in order to take care of everybody. Now, this corridor notion is purposely set up to say, look, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're just saying you can make some choices sort of within this minima and maxima. So to go to your question about how to talk about that in ways that doesn't sound like you're taking away people's freedom, I think the first thing that I've learned is that you just need to remind people of what they already know.
Mhm.
People want to make usually day to day their own choices within sort of reasonable constraints and an understanding of the consequences. So, you know, I mean, I have a limit on the amount of chocolate I eat each day, or the amount of wine I drink each week, right? I know if I exceed that limit, it's not going to be great. We have limits in our family. My son wants more screen time than I allow him to have. There's a limit and there's a floor. So I think we're all kind of aware of that, and it's to then help people as facilitators, not as policymakers or academics talking down to them, to begin to think about how floors and ceilings in particular contexts for particular sectors might actually make everybody's life sort of better off. And so there are a couple of examples that come up. I mean, one is around housing. We're seeing increasingly now that there are limits on vacation housing in some cities, because if vacation houses get bought up by folks, then there's not enough housing for regular folks, right? So that's a limit that people can generally sort of get behind, because they see a virtue to that. Or in transportation, we see things like congestion pricing, or if you're living in a dense area in an apartment or a condo, maybe you're only allowed one residential parking permit, because if we give you two, there won't be enough for others. And so there are all of these examples where limits actually help us navigate life in a way that feels just and wonderful. I think where we get into trouble about talking about limits, and this comes up in a book a colleague and I did some time ago called The Environmental Politics of Sacrifice. Where we get in trouble with limits is if it feels like somebody is telling you you've got to
Mhm.
sacrifice or you've got to be limited. I think that doesn't work.
In a lot of ways, this is an absolute not radical at all. This is Adam Smith. Both Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments makes these arguments over and over and over.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
but what a lot of Americans perceive these self-imposed limits that you're suggesting that we embrace as constriction, as preventing them from exercising their full freedom. How do you get across the importance of the message that if everybody has a basic level of well-being, those of us who have more can feel safer too? Is that part of the problem that we're dealing with right now? Is the wealth disparities have become so extreme that it's no longer possible to think of ourselves as part of a complete society, but as just a tiny part of a tiny fraction of it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. Yes. I was really taken by a little piece that David French, a
Mhm.
columnist for the New York Times, wrote a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote down the title of it, but I'm not going to be able to find it. It was something to the effect of, why are Americans so unhappy even though they're so rich? And in that little piece, he sort of covers what those of us in consumption studies have been talking about for a while, is that when you have lots of inequality, you get in this situation where, you and I might be pretty, we're comfortable, but so much of consumption is relative comparison. So if you see somebody else is getting a better deal, David French uses this idea of on an airplane, right? You got to wait in line. Someone else gets to cut the line because they're a super sort of a super member and they can move through and get something nice. That when you see these asymmetries in access and in consumption levels, it can make whatever sort of we have feel just not
Diminished.
enough. Yeah, now and that's not to take away from the fact that there's a group of people in American society in particular who just don't have enough, right?
Yeah,
So I don't mean to sort of
absolutely.
I don't mean to sort of ignore that, but for the rest of us, it's this kind of relative comparison game, and inequality. I can tell you, we know this empirically is one of the major drivers of the overconsumption machine, to the extent that we are consuming more and more per capita each year. And as I say that, I know I'm hiding disparities. It's an average. And yet our level of happiness has stayed the same over the last 20, 25 years or has declined. I mean, oh my God, if we were consuming more and we were happier, at least we'd be destroying the planet for a little bit of happiness. But that's not happening because what's occurring is, we're getting more, but somebody else is getting even more. We compare ourselves to them and then we feel diminished.
Well, and we're also leaving less for future generations, and that is not good in the long term, to put it
No,
simply.
it is not. And this is where this maxima and minima come from. I think the consumption corridor notion, which is really beginning to take off now in Europe, particularly around housing and transportation, and a lot
Mhm.
of urban planners are being involved in that. We may not be talking about hard limits necessarily at the top, but it may be a set of regulations or incentives that greatly discourage people from continuing to climb that consumption ladder. And if you can do that, then what you do is you begin to reduce the overall disparity in consumption levels, which can slow down this tendency for us to be comparing ourselves against sort of one another.
That comparing ourselves can be short-circuited by embracing some foundational values. And I've been reading the philosopher Ariel Boehm's book, Radical Universalism, which
Yeah.
anchors on the idea that the protection of personal dignity or the recognition of personal dignity is a foundation on which society can be rebuilt inclusively, where we don't become part of one little tribe fighting the rest of the planet for access to the resources we want, but that we create a shared society in which there can still be wealth and a lot of pleasure, but also live within the limits of the planet. What do you suggest the foundational value we embrace as a society is, and how would you integrate that into your relationship with your customers if you were a company?
The foundational value for society. Yeah, I think off the top of my head, I think that if we were thinking about human dignity and we were thinking about some degree of justice that we could all sort of get behind, then I think then the environmental protection nature piece takes care of itself to a great degree, because so much of what we would think of as environmental disruption or pollution is really the crap. It could
Hmm.
be carbon, it could be toxins, it could be sludge. It's the crap that gets produced by some people who are consuming a great deal, and they don't see the consequences of their actions, the waste flow, the inevitable waste flow, and then that gets dumped, deposited on others. And so if we're really taking a kind of human dignity seriously, we want to create systems uh, whereby the consequences of my consumption choices sort of come to me, or we imagine that they do, rather than being deposited on less powerful, more defenseless people, then I think then that takes care of of the of the of the business case. We don't want to be creating what economists would call these externalities that are hidden away. Instead, we want to be thinking about modes of production and consumption that may embrace, to some extent, circular economy thinking, and
Hmm.
that in particular sort of isn't sort of driving that consumption machine, that maybe is embracing notions of sufficiency as much as efficiency.
Well, and Consumption Corridors argues that the minima and maxima should be designed through very deliberative democratic processes, not imposed on us. And you outline a three-stage process for doing that kind of community deliberation. Has it been tried anywhere? And how would you suggest somebody think about embracing it as part of either their personal local practice or as part of their business?
That three-step process, which is really to pull people together that represent your community,
Hmm.
and let's talk about what we care about, our visions and our goals for the good life. And then the step two would be, okay, let's think about how we get there for everybody. And that will often then focus on not so much what do we need or want, like I need a McMansion. No, you need a decent house. How do we begin to think about getting to those goals with a collection of needs? And then the third component would be talking about, okay, well, what do we do as a community? Is that through regulation? Is that through peer pressure? Is that through taxes in order to pull us more to this goal and vision? And in the Consumption Corridors book, readers will note that this three-step process is put forward as largely aspirational. But I have to
Hmm.
tell you, the huge aha experience for me, and I just should have been paying more attention. The huge aha experience for me was around this proliferation of so-called citizen assemblies
Hmm.
across Europe around climate change that been running for many years. As of 2023, there were more than a dozen EU countries that have consistently run these citizen assemblies. So it's the same idea. You bring people together and they negotiate. And these citizen assemblies were asked, often by Parliament, to come together and to see if they could come to agreement on a set of processes moving forward and goals to deal with the climate crisis. Now, these assemblies are typically 30 to 200 people. They are a mix of, they reflect the heterogeneity of the country. They're given scientific and technical advice, but there are no experts telling them kind of what to do. And of course, it's
Hmm.
facilitated. And what you see again and again, and I've seen this actually in smaller scale, is that when you bring regular people together across class, ideological spectrum, and you say, what do we care about? Well, most people care about the same thing: family, community, love, connection, having a meaningful life. What do you care about? And how are we going to get there? What you find across these negotiated collections of individuals is a much higher degree of support for sufficiency measures. That is, for measures that would really dampen consumption and use the benefits of reduced upper level consumption to try to use that in ways that would help people on the bottom. And for listeners who might be curious about that, they should shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send them some research results.
Do we have the right political system or approach to political deliberation now that we are a deeply connected planet? Is that one of the things that we're wrestling to come to terms with and find a new way forward? Because it could be radically decentralized while at the same time enabled by global coordination of resources.
Nicely put. You know, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the rise of the internet and the advent of social media. And I think one thing that pains me when I travel, I still read books and look out the window and people watch, you know, old-fashioned that way. And everyone is just sort of on their devices, sort of just completely removed from the people next to them. I love chatting people up in the train or the plane or the bus, and that just doesn't really happen much anymore.
Mhm.
So there's something happening there. And of course, this is not an original thought with the technology that has insinuated itself into our lives and the way in which we rely on that to live almost solitary lives or connections to people who are not next to us. And I think there's a real loss there, but there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. And so it does seem to me, and I'm right with you, is that the task is for us in our own way, with me making the promise that if you do it, you'll thank me for it later, which is to put the screen down, as I say in my book, and just join a group or a club. And there's one section in the book where I'm inspired by Robert Putnam, the political scientist who wrote Bowling Alone and lamented the loss of social connection because of the atrophying of these community groups that people used to sort of belong to. naturally is just put that screen down, go join a group. Doesn't need to be environmental, just begin to develop social connections. And then as you do that, if there are ways of connecting with eco-local initiatives, which are often networked globally but are happening locally in one's community, and you know this from where you live, I'm sure, to be drawn into that can then open up lots of possibilities for one's own personal sort of psychology as well as for the planet. So I think the systems of governance that we live in have remained largely the same for the
Yeah.
last couple of hundred years, right? But it's how we have understood our role in that governance system, and it's how we have, I think, missed out on some of the joys of connecting with others who may care about the things that we connect about. Now, as I say that, I know that can be incredibly difficult in these polarized times where it seems hard, to have a meaningful conversation with somebody without sort of stepping into it. But I think we need to try. If we care enough to be super shoppers in the market for the planet, then we need to care enough to bring our energy to bear on actions that are likely going to be more effective for the planet and in the long run better for us.
You would think so. I'm not sure people always rationally work that out, but let me ask this. You obviously work with a lot of young people as a teacher. If based on the way they behave today in your classes and their engagement with these ideas and their approach to developing solutions, what would the world look like in 2040 if they get the resources they need to put their vision in place?
Hmm. I'm going to be a little bit of a downer here.
Okay.
Um, and that's not my natural thing. I've never belonged to the apocalyptic camp of sort of, environmentalism.
Mhm.
I take a page out of Kim Stanley Robinson's book, the Hugo Award-winning sci-fi writer, who I think many of your listeners may know him from his work, The Ministry of the Future, but he's
Great
written a
book.
number of, yeah. I was on a panel with Stan some years ago with the World Watch Institute, and Stan was making the case that, the question for him was, is it too late? And he says, well, it kind of depends on your time horizon. You know,
Mhm.
he says, if you're thinking, is it too late to save what we're losing in the next 10 years, then yeah, it might be because the trajectory of things like ice loss and climate change and biodiversity erosion and a set of global market forces that seem to poorly take into account sort of ecological goods and services. Yeah, it's going to probably get worse before it gets better. But he said if you take the long run view, if you say that in 4 or 5 generations that things are going to be much better, and we understand ourselves as beginning a process of setting in motion ideas, technologies, business practices, values, governance systems that will begin to bend the arc of human experience towards a peaceful coexistence with the non-human world. If you think of it that way, then we are blessed to be on the planet at this point. We are in a situation where our progeny 4 or 5 generations from now will say, damn, those people living in 2024, 2025, they had a lot on their plate. But despite that, they still rolled up their sleeves and they got the ball rolling. They took the long view and they made things happen. And so I don't preach this perspective to my students, but when they come to me knowing about the trends that we're seeing sort of come together, I share that perspective with them. That, you know, hope is a verb. Make something happen, knowing that down the line people will thank you for that. I think that's where one goes with this. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that we still aren't hopeful or reasonably, clearly, honestly optimistic about what can happen in our own communities. I think there's a lot that we can do with one another in the next 15 years or so to really improve resilience, reduce inequality, and help us get through the tough times. And I think that's what we ought to be doing.
It puts me in mind of meeting Jane Goodall, who radiated that act of hope.
Yes.
And it's so important to keep that in mind as we continue to move through this process of losing what we currently have, but also building something that's profoundly better. And I want to thank you for really emphasizing that progressive view, not progressive in the left-right sense, but that humans have the ability to move forward and improve the lives of everyone. Michael, it's been a great conversation. How can folks follow along and particularly reach out to you and get that research you mentioned?
Yeah, I think if they want to go to my website, michaelmaniates.com, they'll see my email information. They can Google me. They just ought to drop me a note. While I'm dodging shrapnel here, I'm sort of stuck at home, so it'd be my pleasure to sort of respond to folks and assist anyone with any kinds of questions they may have. Regular folks who are looking to make a difference, business or entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out what the academic literature might tell them about how to put their aspirations into tangible action, or anyone else. Be delighted to chat.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Mitch.
Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. You've been listening to my conversation with Michael Maniates. He's an environmental social scientist, senior fellow with the Story of Stuff Project, and author of The Living Green Myth, The Promise and Limits of Lifestyle Environmentalism. That's published by Polity Press, and you can find it online at Amazon, on Powell Books, and other fine booksellers. You can also find Michael's work and more about him, including his email address, so you can reach him and ask those questions at michaelmaniates.com. That's all one word, no space, no dash, michaelmaniates.com. This conversation might feel uncomfortable for anyone who's ever felt kind of proud while recycling, and I include myself in that group. Michael has spent decades looking at the evidence and has reached a conclusion that many in the sustainability community avoid. Changing consumer behavior alone is not an effective environmental strategy. Aspiration is not enough. Real impact requires action combined with policy to create widespread change. In other words, you have to redesign society, not just start rebuilding it from the inside. We actually have to do both. Global carbon emissions reached another high in 2024, and atmospheric CO2 at this moment is at more than 429 parts per million. Even with a $500 billion market for eco-labeled products, the climate trends have not improved. Michael explains that this is not because people lack the right values. After all, Pew surveys show that Americans care about the environment as much as Europeans do. The real issue is the system, not the people, the maze, not the mouse. Europeans tend to act more sustainably because they live in cities with good public transit and strong recycling programs. In other words, the maze is configured for sustainability. By contrast, Americans live in a system that makes sustainable choices harder, and yet they're still blamed for their decisions when they don't make the right ones by environmentalists. So they're caught in a kind of double bind. Michael points to what he calls the deepest failure, the fact that people put in real effort, then see little impact and feel growing anxiety as the gap between effort and results remains wide open. The reason this gap remains is the belief that's at the heart of consumer sustainability, the idea that if enough people make the right purchase, their choices will add up to real change, even more than political action could. Michael's research shows that this idea is not supported by evidence, it leads to burnout and distracts from the more effective work of active citizenship. And it's with that word, citizenship, that this conversation gets genuinely interesting. Michael's argument isn't that individual action is worthless. It's that individual action in community with others, oriented towards shifting what he calls the default settings of everyday life, is more powerful than individual action in the checkout line alone. In other words, it's a good idea to start talking with the people in line around you at the store, but then to expand that conversation at home, at work, in the community, on the street, with the people that you run into. Social change research consistently shows that committed minorities of 10 or 20% of a population working strategically can drive structural transformation. What keeps the full potential of that energy from being realized in the case of climate is the competing narrative that says you need supermajorities and overwhelming consensus before anything can change. A theory that, as Michael noted, conveniently lets the system off the hook while exhausting everyone who's trying to change it. In fact, small collective actions do build into society-changing movements. And along the way, it's not necessary to lecture people into conformance. It's a matter of demonstrating through action that a different path is possible, and also showing the results so people can see the benefit of the actions that you want them to take. The consumption corridors framework that Michael described, which is built on a small d democratic deliberation over the floor below which no one should fall and the ceiling above which individual consumption begins to compromise everyone else's opportunity for sustenance and satisfaction, may sound radical until you notice where it's already happening. We have congestion pricing in major cities, vacation home restrictions in housing scarce cities, residential parking permit limits, and there are also many ordinary political instruments negotiated through ordinary democratic processes that are already making a difference. And the citizen assemblies in more than a dozen European countries have repeatedly shown that when ordinary people cross class and ideological lines to discuss what they actually care about, they tend to converge on the same things: family, community, connection, and a decent life. And with that in common, that common human grounding established, they tend to produce stronger sufficiency measures than experts predict they will. So there is a real change here that Michael's framework does not fully solve, and that is that citizenship requires time, strong civic systems, and social trust, all of which are now rare. The loss of community didn't happen by chance. It was created by systems that benefit more from isolated consumers than from active citizens. And restoring the connections of civic life in a time of screens and division is not something technology alone can fix. It's a political issue, and it's incumbent on each of us to embrace the responsibilities that come with citizenship rather than passively enjoying our rights and privileges while everybody else suffers. Michael's closing thought stuck with me. In 4 or 5 generations, people are going to look back and wonder if those of us who understood the stakes actually took action. Kim Stanley Robinson's view that it's not too late if we think in terms of generations instead of the decades immediately ahead. This kind of hope can become real, not just a slogan, because long-term thinking always asks us to do more, not less. And that's why human society makes progress. So stay tuned. We're going to keep talking with thinkers and doers who are rewriting the rules of what's possible. And I hope in the meantime you'll take a look at the archive of more than 550 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear and share a few of them with your friends. Take some action. Write a review on your favorite podcast platform, and that will help your neighbors find us because, folks, you're the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. Please tell your friends, family, coworkers, the people you meet on the street that they can find Sustainability in Your Ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.